Aqui nós estamos com
We have our 22nd seminar, and at a very important time for the world. Our topic is the topic of carbon management. Of course, we are centered on the world of coffee, but we will exchange information, and it goes well beyond coffee. It is useful for all those involved in agro-industrial processes. My name is Décio Zilberstein. I coordinate PENSA, and also I work in the University of Caffè. So we are at a time of climate challenge, and the world is now. I believe the world stopped a little to deal with the pandemic, but we will focus now on a zero carbon economy. And to go in this direction, many countries are making commitments, but apart from countries, I would say that as important as this are the commitments that companies are defining in their strategies for a carbon management in the productive chain, in the production chain where they are present. It's an enormous challenge that we have. The world does not have time. We cannot waste time. These 2 years, 2020, 2021, show us the need to organize at all levels of society to deal with topics that are challenging the existence of life on the planet as we know it. One has to do with the pandemic, and the other has to do with global warming. So that is the importance of the research that was done last year. And today, we are here to debate this topic. This material, and also all the material from the 2 decades of research are available on our website, the UdC notebooks, and also this is our 11th seminar. I would like to introduce the participants of this meeting. Our first participant is my dear friend and Samuel Ribeiro Giordano, engineer agronomist from the University of São Paulo, and he graduated from the University of São Paulo, senior researcher at PENSA and University of Coffee. We also have Marco Antonio Fujihara, agronomist, consultant for companies in the environmental area, giving support to companies that adopt or want to adopt strategies connected to the parameters recommended in international agreements on the climate. That is the experience of Marco Antonio Fujihara. His experience was very important during the previous year and this year. We have also the presence of Professor Carlos Eduardo Cherry, agronomist, professor at the University of São Paulo, a specialist on carbon management in soils. So we think of carbon in plants, and we forget the enormous importance of the potential for capture and maintenance of carbon in the soil. So the presence of Professor Cherry is very important, and we thank him very much for being here. Professor Konstantinos Karantininis, a dear friend of ours for decades, professor at the Swedish University of Agriculture and Sciences, PhD from the University of Saskatchewan, Canada, and known all over the world for his work. So we have many points in common apart from the work he did last year for us. And his focus is always on contracts in agriculture, and we have the same interests. So this is the group that we have. I ask a question to Chris Lelis. Is Samuel with us? Samuel Ribeiro Giordano? Yes, he is with us. Samuel is with us. Marvelous. Okay, so I pass the floor to our first speaker, Samuel Ribeiro Giordano. Our program, you can see here the agenda on the video. So we will continue with Samuel, then Mr. Fujihara, Constantinis, and Cherry. We want you to participate. We want the participants to send questions. So friends who are hearing us, so during the presentations, if you have ideas, questions, please contact us via chat. Chris will be looking at the chat. We may not be able to answer all questions, but we will try. Samuel Ribeiro Giordano, you had the floor. Okay. Good morning to all. It's a great pleasure to be together once again with our event, our traditional event, our seminar. And let's go directly to the point. To begin, we will talk about this material that you have seen that was distributed, the agricultural systems in the 20th and 21st centuries. These movements that I placed on this graph, they are not new. These are movements, actions that began in the beginning of the 20th century with Rudolf Steiner. Then we had the participation of Austrian professors, such as Mr. Pfeiffer. We had the participation of American as Rodale, and English and from England, Howard, who really made their studies. All this happened. We had also the other movement, the natural agriculture in Japan, Mr. Mukichi Okada and Minazofu Fukova. They all tried to go back, a return. Let's wait a few seconds. We believe we had a problem in the connection. These movements will result in reality in the consolidation of many ideas that are very important, and these will result in an important point in our discussion. This coincides with fixing the carbon in the soil. All these movements aim at fixation of carbon in the soil, and they had different motivations. Changing the slide now. In the 50s and 60s, they took a certain direction due to the Green Revolution. So we can say that the concept of virtuous agriculture is new, but the concepts are known for more than 100 years. So the concept of virtuous agriculture is linked to well-defined points. The balanced use
oscilando a ligação.
And we had a technical problem.
Está oscilando bastante a ligação do Samuel. Se persistir, eu darei uma mão, tá bom, Cris?
Me ouve, Décio?
Agora sim, Samuel. Prosseguindo, manda bala.
Okay, let's continue, please. We're having a fluctuation.
Acho que eu vou dar uma mão, Cris. Eu vou seguir como eu ouvi essa palestra do Samuel já algumas vezes. Ele retomando, ele toma minha palavra, mas eu vou apoiar o meu querido amigo. Então, ele dizia, né, que esse conceito de agricultura virtuosa tem alguns...
Virtuous agriculture has some well-known pillars, but they haven't been adopted. So the idea is a good usage of the soil in nature by man. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Décio. So we had these events in the 20th century, the Green Revolution, which was a great challenge between generating excess food. There were some forecasts that the population would grow more than the production of food. So the Green Revolution was a great effort to supply food in quantity and quality, introducing genetics, classic genetics, and other elements with a heavy use of inputs, fertilizer, and this resulted in an unbalance in the carbon emissions. We have solutions from science and technology, we have regulatory solutions, and we have also the adoption of these practices that are very important. All these movements already mentioned, I noticed through research that there's a unification of all these trends. So they are forming an international front for natural agriculture. So there is a convergence of all these trends. We have the responsibility in the political field, a global responsibility that changed in these last few years, especially during the last year. We have seen the US once again having a leadership position in this global reaction. This is a very positive factor, and also the concern with global warming, which is a real threat in this agricultural scenario. So urgent decisions should be made for us to have a greater neutralization of carbon. So regenerative and virtuous agriculture, we see this with a lot of, we're very optimistic. It'll be very good for global agriculture. Well, basically, this is what I had to say. Thank you, Samuel. I would like to say that this information that Samuel gave us, his text, his studies are very complete. He gives us information of all these movements in literature. So behind this effort that we have today, we see during centuries, for centuries, many efforts here and there, especially in the universities, the development of adequate technologies. So questions, please send us the questions via chat. Now, Marco Antonio Fujihara, you have the floor. Good morning, Décio. Good morning to all. Thank you for the invitation to contribute. Let's go on to the first slide, please. So very rapidly, what is, so the trade, emissions trade. The first, we have the regulatory market, the market from diplomatic agreements, beginning with Kyoto, and then 5 years ago, the agreements in Paris. The Paris agreements changed this market of emissions trading. So for example, the Paris Agreement says that all countries are responsible. In the Kyoto Agreement, some countries were responsible and some were not. So the regulated markets, based on these agreements that already exist, they need regulation. In the case of the Paris Agreement, especially Article number 6, which foresees these mechanisms, but they need regulation. We hope that now in Glasgow, in the meeting in Glasgow, these mechanisms may be regulated. There's another market called the voluntary market. Voluntary markets are markets that follow certain standards, and companies contribute to reduce emissions. Remember that the voluntary markets have their own standards. There are many standards around the world that we can use in agriculture. There are at least 4 or 5 different standards. Today, we're testing some standards in the field, but they exist, and voluntary markets are growing because not everyone will adapt themselves to the mandatory market. So this is a commitment on the part of companies. Although companies take on commitments in the voluntary market, but we don't have the necessary transparency to get to climate neutrality. The third market is the jurisdictional, by jurisdictions. We have some very old examples. The market in California that exists for many years. China has a jurisdictional market in 50% of the provinces in China. They have this jurisdictional market. They are already contributing for this market. And then the trend in China is to raise the standard and then on a global level. So in reality, this is a little of what we have in terms of markets in the world and what they are doing. There are many formats of voluntary and jurisdictional markets, but most of these markets, they understand that the main point is the pricing. How do you price? So there are many formats for pricing of carbon. The cost of carbon, for example, some have a rate that is already stipulated by the government. If it's a rate, normally it's similar to, you have the tax and the rates. Companies should calculate the pricing, internal price of carbon. It is the reference for markets to reach their goals. It is the basic reference, whether you have a regulated, voluntary, or jurisdictional market. The jurisdictional markets have grown a lot in Brazil too, due to the absence of a national regulation. And in spite of having some projects in Congress in Brazil, they are still in their infancy. I understand that jurisdictional markets will grow a lot in Brazil, especially in markets linked to agriculture and soil carbon. There are some pilot tests being done in the south of Maranhão, in the north of Brazil, in Mato Grosso. They are running some tests. I believe these jurisdictional markets may grow a lot. Here we have an overview of what is happening in the world. you receive this material, you can see it. The main jurisdictional market that has grown a lot is the Chinese market because of two parameters. Technology, the technological level in China has grown very much. Today, China is the greatest investor in this area. They invest twice as much as the US. I don't know what will happen with President Biden, who is going to use electric cars. They're going to use in the government only electric cars in the Biden government. Okay. Next slide. Here we have a little of the evolution of jurisdictional markets in the world. You can see that there are many jurisdictional markets: Australia, South Korea, France, California, Alberta, Ontario. These markets, the trend is growth, and the markets I mentioned in Brazil, the trend is for the jurisdictional markets will grow much more in Brazil than the national markets. I don't see a lot of optimism in Congress to regulate these markets in Brazil on a national level. So there is a lack of knowledge in Congress in Brazil. So jurisdictional markets will certainly grow. Well, this is what I had to say. The last message is the following. We have many markets that help companies to reach their goals. But what I have seen, and my great concern, is that companies, although they have goals, although they have the offset market, they are not able to detail in a transparent way how to reduce their emissions. So many people talk about carbon positive, carbon negative, and so there are many issues, and companies should know and reveal their processes with more transparency to have more credibility. And the carbon market doesn't give you this credibility. It needs other factors in order to give credibility to the system. So this is what I had to say. We are available in the Q&A session later on in the debate. Thank you, Marco. Let's continue. Now we would like to hear Constantini Karantininis, Professor Constantinos Karantininis now.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you. And I cannot tell you how happy I am that I joined this panel and this event, joined my friends in Brazil, which, as Decio said, we started many years ago. But coming to this, I want to continue the discussion that Marco started earlier. He gave us a very nice overview of policies. I want to focus a little bit on two things. I want to focus on some particular regions, if you want, to Europe, a little bit on China and Africa. And I want to emphasize mostly that my take in all this is agriculture. What does it have to do with agriculture? So let me start sharing my screen. Can you see the slide now? Can you see my screen? Yes, okay, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so if we start with the European Union, the European Union has basically three instruments, if you want, in policy relating to emissions. The ETS policy, which is in the sense that emissions are trading. So they have established the European emissions trading system, the ETS, which involves today more than 11,000 installations. As it is today, the ETS system, and I emphasize that today because it's about to change, or at least there is a discussion which we will not know yet until June, when the new package by the European Commission is revealed. Today, it involves basically the energy and the airline sector. So firms can buy and sell emissions permits in this market. Currently, the price in that market has really skyrocketed. It reached the level of $45, 45 euros per ton. It was only 15 just a year ago, and when it started it was in the €5. So you can see the really big change. The second instrument is on the country basis. The second instrument of the European Union, it is the effort sharing regulation. So basically countries take up their responsibility and pledge that they're going to reduce emissions by so much. Okay, so that is the second instrument, and the countries, they have set some targets that they're going to reduce emissions by each country its own levels by 2030, and I will show you in a minute how much they have achieved that. And the third refers to the land use change and forestry, the LULUCF regulation, which are emissions from these sectors, which are offset by removal of CO2 in the atmosphere in the period 2021-2030. So these are the three instruments in the European Union. The targets of reducing emissions by the European Union is shown in this graph. Very ambitious targets. Europe is planning to be carbon neutral by 2050. They have revised this to make it a bit earlier, and so far, according to the calculation of the European Environmental Agency, Europe is ahead of its schedule. Is ahead of its schedule to reach the targets, the 2030 targets. So it's a very good time for these bureaucrats when they measure these emissions. On a country level, on a country per country level, they made some calculations, in this in the voluntary, in the per country level emissions, and things do not look very good in Europe. There are only 3 countries that, according to these calculations, the measures that they have taken, they're going to reach their targets by 2030. These are estimates. Okay, so these are estimates that the countries will reach their targets by 2030. Estimates were made a year ago, okay, in 2020. So these 3 countries are Sweden, Portugal, and Greece. All the other countries, according to these estimates, are not within target. China, on the other hand, I'm not going to spend much time because I think Marcos covered this very well. But this is basically the strategy of China. China has introduced regional markets of emissions, and some of them are functioning better than others. They have different prices according to supply and demand, and the government is trying to really regulate and see how this is going. They have made tremendous changes. They have even changed the ministry of responsible for all this. So great expectations from China. The big issue with China is that it is investing very much in the renewable energy. So China is ahead in solar panels and in other renewable energy sources. So they are the leader in the world today in the production of energy with renewable resources. Finally, when we take a look at Africa, it's very interesting because if we see here, these are the emissions by continents, and we can see that the bottom, the bigger contributors is of course Asia Pacific. That's because China is in there, and other big emitters. Africa is very small contributor, and yet Africa is the continent who's going to be affected more than anybody else, than any other continent by climate change. So they're contributing very little, and they're going to receive the all the impacts, or mostly the impacts from climate change. I would like to, I mean, in closing, I just want to make a few comments that relate to agriculture. What we see late, I think what is important here is that agriculture all of a sudden appears to be on the credit side rather than on the debit side of this debate. So agriculture can contribute positively to reducing the emissions. So instead of emitting, agriculture is going on a net. Agriculture is capable of reducing emissions. That is, putting carbon back in the soil where it came from, actually, because what we observe, as we will see in the next presentation and in the discussion, what we have observed in the last century is basically carbon taking from the soil in terms of oil and burning into the atmosphere. Now agriculture is requested to put it back to the soil. What does it mean to the farmers? What it means to the farmers is that farmers now can produce a new product, and that is reduction of emissions. They're not only producing wheat and food and fiber, but they can produce also carbon sequestration. Now, how is this going to be remunerated back to the farmers? How farmers are going to be paid for this public good that they're going to produce? Is the new policy going to translate, to make this public good into a private good, that is to be sold, bought and sold in the market like the other emissions? And how this is going to work, this is something that we are yet to see. What we have observed is some private initiatives, some very micro private initiatives where firms that are into the agri-food chain, large corporations like Cargill and others, that are making contracts with farmers, that they're going to remunerate the farmers, they're going to pay the farmers for their contribution to this, on how much carbon they're sequestrating. But these are done on private contracts. So these are just private initiatives. In Europe, they have put the agricultural, this commodity, if you want, this public good that agriculture is expected to produce, a reduction of CO2, they put it into the subsidy realm. So this the contribution of agriculture to this is part of the common agricultural policy. So farmers are going to be paid back for the reduction of CO2 in various forms, so that is, so the public good has been into the subsidy side, and this is something. I just remind you, for those that are following this, that the Common Agricultural Policy is announced, and the program is a 7-year program, and the new 7-year program of the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, was supposed to start in 2020, and it was postponed. It's still under negotiation, and one of the major things is exactly this: how they're going to handling the greening, the further greening, as it's called in the European jargon of agriculture. We're not going to see the new CAP in 2021. Probably, I mean, what we are expecting is sometime early in 2022, we're going to see the final package. On top of that, and I'm closing with us, the European Union has announced a huge package, investment package, which was actually revealed as the COVID pandemic was sweeping the world and Europe in the early the beginning of last year. The Green Deal. The Green Deal is a huge investment package of the European Union, which plans to invest and spend about 1 trillion euros for the period 2020-2050. For the next 30 years, 1 trillion euros. And most of it is to convert the economy, the European economy, into a sustainable economy. Much of this has to do with reducing emissions and cleaning the environment and so on. My final point is, the question that I think we should discuss and should worry those of us. Worry perhaps is a bit heavy word, but we should, to some extent, for those of us that are working on agriculture, is that there are more than 500 million farmers in the world, and the majority of them are small farmers. How is this system going to remunerate these, to pay these farmers for this public good that they're going to produce, something that everybody is going to benefit? A lot of these farmers are in Africa, a lot of these farmers are in Asia, in Latin America. They're poor farmers, they're subsistence farmers, and the whole world is going to benefit from this public good that these farmers are producing, and they're going to produce more in the future. So how are they going to be remunerated? How are they going to be paid back for this public good that they're going to produce for the planet? Thank you very much.
Obrigado, Costas. Thank you very much, Costas. A sequência das apresentações, elas me motivam muito, antes de caminhar agora para o professor Serri. O Samuel traz ao histórico da preocupação.
Talks about the history of the concern with the environment, with different movements that resulted in the modern concepts of virtuous agriculture, concepts that are still being formatted. Then Marcos Fujihara brought us the vision, the importance of non-regulated initiatives from private markets, showing that they exist and have a great potential. Then we heard also Konstantinos Karantininis. He showed us what is being done in Europe. The European experience shows that regulation is important, the institutional important. They have important guidelines. This is very important. And these guidelines really affect all the actors, all the industries. He talked about airlines and also power systems. And we have this influencing our leaders, like in Brazil. We would like our leaders in Brazil to understand this, that the Amazon, for example, the Amazon supplies services, and this can be paid. So we can maintain this environment, producing services in the Amazon for the whole world. We want to be paid for this. And Konstantinis talked about this, showing how the environment, any of these actions, private or public, have an important point that take us to the next presentation from Professor Carlos Eduardo Serri, which is the measurement. Whatever the environment, for the markets to exist, we have to measure. How can I pay, compensate if I can't measure? One of the important contributions, Professor Yoram Barzel also talks about cost of measurement. There's an enormous cost of measurement for the capture of carbon. And Professor Serri will talk about this. Okay, sir, you have Carlos Eduardo, so you have the floor. Mr. Décio, thank you. Good morning. Good morning to some, good afternoon to others. It is a great satisfaction to participate with these brilliant colleagues, to be part of this panel, and to talk a little with you about these points that Professor Décio mentioned. And now focusing on the measurement of carbon. Measurement of carbon, the carbon inventory in the soil, in agricultural systems. You had access to a larger presentation. I will give you only the main points, beginning with the idea. Why soil? Professor Décio mentioned at the beginning of our event, but if you notice this information, we have the biosphere, we have many compartments, pools where we find carbon. Atmosphere is one of them. These values are approximations to give us an idea in a technical unit, which is petagrams of carbon. Peta means 10 times 15. To facilitate, let's think of billions of tons, petagrams. The atmosphere has 760 billion tons. In the plants, in vegetation around the globe, there's a variation, but let's use this value, 500 billion tons of carbon. And what you know is that in the soil, if we take into consideration the first meter of topsoil, we have 1,500 petagrams, which is 3 times more than what we find in the atmosphere in terms of carbon and in vegetation. If we look at the first 30 centimeters of topsoil, why 30 centimeters? Which is the arable layer, the layer that has conditions to have an impact, where we use implements and cultivate. There we have 800 petagrams, a considerable amount of carbon. So you can see the issue is, if we are not careful, if we don't treat well the soil, this carbon in the soil can be oxidated and then be transformed into gases like CO2 or methane, or gases that contain nitrogen as nitrous oxide, an important gas of the greenhouse emissions of the greenhouse gases. And this will go to the atmosphere. And this compartment will grow. The carbon in atmosphere will grow. We want the opposite. As mentioned, we want to remove carbon from the atmosphere and mobilize this in plants through photosynthesis, and this carbon is transferred to the soil. So this compartment in the atmosphere will be reduced. So once in the soil, this carbon is in organic matter, which can have interactions and thus give stability to the carbon. So this carbon can remain for a long time in soil. This is important. We talk about the permanence of this carbon inside soil. So this is not only important, but this carbon, we want it to stay for a long time in the soil, thus giving stability to carbon in soil. And this carbon will be in the form of organic matter that improves the soil. So it improves the physical attributes of soil, chemical attributes, and thus this environment becomes better and plants can develop. So we want to measure this carbon in the soil. There are many alternatives, procedures, some of them more generic, and some we even take samples in the field to measure. So here, these estimates, we have mathematical models. Some of these tools are through simulation. Others are tools where you need information about the soil, climate, and these tools give you an estimate in terms of the potential for the soil to accumulate carbon. These tools can give us an estimate of the potential reduction of carbon in the atmosphere, but CO2 in the atmosphere. But since they are simplified tools, they have considerable uncertainty. There's another group of tools that are frameworks. For example, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has 3 tiers, 3 levels for evaluation, but they are all estimates and they are for national use. So how a country can really do this at the same time, so they can fix the carbon in the soil at the same time as they have emissions too. And finally, I would like to focus on direct measurements. So it involves more work than previous tools, but there is a trend to really use them more. So for this, we need to go to the field. We have to identify the areas. For example, we have different usages of the land. On the right, you have native vegetation. We can use this as a reference. And an area of sugarcane plantation and pasture. So we have to go to the field, prepare samples. There are many procedures. I suggest that the colleagues that haven't seen the material to read the text, very well prepared, very well written by professors. And I had the intention to participate and write about these methods. We have to open a trench, collect soil samples, take it to a lab, and determine the density of the soil in order to see the soil carbon stock. So we multiply the content by the density and the thickness of the soil. As you can see, this requires a lot of work, but it is the most correct and most precise way of obtaining this data. These values are expressed in kilograms per square meter per hectare, and they become even more important depending on the methods we use to determine this carbon stock. You can see here the uncertainty becomes greater at the bottom of the pyramid. And as you get to the top, there is more complexity, greater sampling and analytical complexity. But you have levels with greater uncertainty at the bottom of the pyramid, but they are simpler at the same time. You have cheaper methods at the base of the pyramid with less precision. For example, oxidation, wet oxidation, until the situation at the top of the pyramid with greater precision, which require equipment, expensive equipment, and also measuring bulk density. Details about this we can talk in the next steps. Finally, my time is running out. Finally, why determine the amount of carbon? Apart from the idea in the first slides, this carbon can really affect the carbon footprint. I gave the example of coffee, which seems to me the most important part in our conversation today. All the emissions of greenhouse gases are present not only in agriculture, as you see on the left, but also here in the industrial part, and even transportation of this coffee to the domestic market or abroad. All these emissions associated to a bag of coffee, a kilogram of coffee, can be measured as sources of emissions. Strategies can be used to reduce these emissions, but we can expand the scope, the footprint, including, for example, carbon in vegetation and soil, and also to see the amount. This is what I had to say. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very happy to participate in the debate, which will be certainly the most important part. Thank you, Professor Seri. I would like to thank all the speakers. Now, Chris will take care of the very important step, which is the debate, questions, Q&A session. We have many. Chris will have to select the questions. We have many questions. Thank you. The presentations were excellent. I sent to you the questions. And now, as Professor Seri said, we have many questions. I will follow the order of the presentations we had. The first, Professor Samuel, is from Ana Ili. She asks, how can you differentiate virtuous agriculture from regenerative agriculture? What are the main differences? Virtuous, regenerative? A very good question. We are still searching for a better definition of virtuous agriculture, but there is a great proximity. They are very similar. There is no clear difference. Virtuous, regenerative agriculture has been around for more time, but they are very similar. I believe the differences are very small, in my opinion. My colleagues also agree with this, and probably they will mix and form a single practice in the future. The other question from Luciana Florenzi, linked to virtuous agriculture. Lu wants to know, I will summarize, Lu, main examples of application of virtuous agricultural in Brazil or other country, so we can understand the difference with regenerative agriculture. Examples in Brazil. A very good question. I wouldn't say practical examples yet of virtuous agriculture, but I would refer to the agricultural systems that I mentioned from the 20th century, 21st century that are in activity. One example we have on a large scale in Sertãozinho is the production of organic sugar made by a very large industrial group, which placed Brazil as the first producer and exporter of organic sugar in the world. And they have a great production, and they have very good practices. Another example I can give you, public policies by the German government, the Ministry of Agriculture in Germany, 2 decades ago, more than 2 decades ago, to produce fruits and vegetables in an organic way. All these practices are ways of reducing the emissions of carbon to the atmosphere because they presuppose transformations, metabolization, many practices that are very positive. I believe that coffee can have a very important base and also be an example, a culture that will become very important. We have seen efforts. There's a case study. I am the author. This was published in Università do Caffè, Coffee University, and it involves the management and the way the farmers treat the land. Many practices that we will still see in detail.
Samuel,
Just one point I'd like to add, Samuel.
é só comentário muito breve.
One brief comment.
Nas nossas discussões sobre
In our discussions on virtuous agriculture, trying to see the limits of this new concept, there's one aspect that can be a good hint. Virtuous to whom? For who? For what? Virtuous because it maintains the health of the soil, the health of the plant, and there's a third point, which is a difference. Virtuous because it maintains humanity's health. So these 3 points that appeared in our debates, because it maintains also the health of mankind, as I said. So these 3 are together. I just wanted to add this.
Perfeito. Vamos caminhando então.
Okay,
Agora o Fujihara.
Mr. Fujihara. Now let's invite now Mr. Marco Antonio Fujihara to answer the questions. Marco, you have the questions, but I gave you the questions, but I will summarize the question. So we received many questions about the pricing of carbon credits. I will summarize. The questions were, how do we face the volatility of the price of carbon credits? How to evaluate the risk of competition between markets for the price, and the issue of pricing. How do you calculate, how do you value the cost of the reduction of emissions in companies? How and when can we access this market in Brazil? When do you believe this market will be more active in Brazil? And the last, do you believe we need an arbitration chamber to solve problems? Gee, a lot of questions. How do we price carbon? Conceptually, it is done with 2 curves: marginal cost of reduction, where you are trying to reduce emissions, and another, cost of opportunity for this reduction. In the end, the intersection of these 2, and that's the internal price of carbon in companies. That's the concept. There are algorithms, because doing this by hand takes a long time. So we have algorithms that are ready to calculate the pricing. I don't see any possibility of competition between markets, voluntary or regulated or jurisdictional, because they should all converge. And this national accounting will converge to a global accounting. What I see, the way to price these issues is very distant from reality. What price if I don't know the cost of my carbon? I don't know my internal pricing of carbon. So that is why we have this volatility. We have to understand, because what we need to do is we have to understand how to do the internal price of carbon in companies. Coffee can help a lot in this, to help us understand that the calculation of a price is calculated by those who want to reduce and not according to what the market is willing to pay. Well, we have another question. What is lacking for state governments to form jurisdiction and support this market? This is from the south of Brazil, from the state of Rio Grande do Sul. First of all, there is a concept. Although we have seen efforts in the past, we need a concept. It's called additionality. We need a baseline to calculate the accumulation as time goes by. Without this, it's difficult to have a legislation or something. So what is missing in governments? Governments have some initiatives. The government of the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil has some initiatives. These jurisdictional markets should grow in Brazil. On a national level, we are far from regulation. This regulation should not be rigid, should not be strict. It should have the basic concepts. It should also look at pricing, how we price this. So this is a very interesting discussion. Some people think that carbon is a commodity. It's not. For example, you have different areas where you have carbon. I can test things and I can have different prices. What we have seen in the last studies is that the accumulation of carbon in the soil is directly linked to the productivity of agricultural production. But how do we measure this? It's an economic issue. There is not much of a secret. You have to create a model. And Jerry showed us the mathematical models. Then we look at productivity, and then we look at the feasibility of carbon in the soil. State governments could do something, yes. There are people trying. There is a trend in Brazil in this direction, but we have to create models. We need models for the collection of samples, pricing, and also internal calculations. I try to answer, sorry. Thank you, Professor. Now, Constantinos. And then you can speak in English and our translator will translate for us. Okay, now questions for Mr. Constantinos Carantininis. Okay, sir, did you understand? Okay, can we begin, Professor Constantinos Carantininis? We had many questions, Professor. I will summarize them. The main issues, the emissions are linked to greater production. How will we balance a greater production with reduction in emissions? On one side, production is going up. Also, Green Bio and the strategy in Europe for greenhouse effects and sustainable food. Do you believe these regulations in Europe will be the ones that will be directing the large economies and emerging economies? What's your opinion about this, sir?
Thank you for the questions. Very, very interesting questions indeed. All right, the first question, I think, if I understand it, it is whether there is a trade-off between production, agricultural production, and CO2 and carbon sequestration. Is there a trade-off there? I think part of this question was answered earlier by Marco, who said that very correctly that there are studies that they show that this increases productivity. Actually, very recently, I've seen a study from the University of Nebraska that they have shown a very different and very interesting twist in all this is that some plants do better with more CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so they have increased productivity because there is a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's another side. But this is, you know, this is not what it is my specialty. I don't know exactly the agronomics and the chemistry of this. But to me, the most important thing is the economics and how you incentivize this activities in agriculture, and this is going to be, in my view, where the future debate is going to hold. Are we going to see what we see today, for example, in the EU, that the government, that is the central administration, is basically subsidizing farmers for capturing carbon and putting it into the soil, or are we going to see it as a commodity, as very bluntly Marco put it before? We're seeing both. We're seeing some, as I mentioned, some private initiatives where firms are trying to do this. They're trying actually to compensate farmers for doing that, and then getting this certificate and putting it into their own balance sheet. So to speak, okay, in terms of, let's say, in terms of CSR, of corporate social responsibility, because they want to show a better image. Say, here is, I am a firm that is selling you this food, but by the way, we have reduced so many tons of carbon, and they can certify this through the system. So the question is now, if the company, if that firm that touches, that interfaces with the final consumer, if the final consumer is willing to pay some higher price for this, is this transferred back to the firm, to the person, and that is the farmer who has actually done this job? And how is this going to happen? So that is a big question. And here is a question of competition and a question of the organization and governance of the agri-food value chain. Because if the farmer is the weak link in this chain, it is natural that the farmer is going to receive the less of this margin, the shorter piece of this margin, because it's the weak link. So only if larger farmers, let's say plantations, these big plantations in that we see in Brazil or other parts of the world, or organized farmers in collectives, in cooperatives, who they can negotiate this benefit. I mean, the market and the governance and the competition is going to determine where this is going to, which way this is going to go. And again, as I mentioned earlier, our focus should be on the smaller farmers, because these are the ones who are really the weak link in this chain. And I must say that I think if somebody has the bigger view, if we had the capacity to have a drone and fly over and see this whole chain, we can see that that can be a win-win situation. Both ends of the chain can win. The firm that is selling the final product and the farmer who's really using his plants and his soil to do this. It will be a win-win situation, and it will be a win-win for the world. But it needs a collaboration, and it needs a collaboration on the local level, but also on the global level, because this, as we know very well, this is a global issue. I don't know if I answered the question or I raised more questions, but this is my job, is to raise questions. Now, the other question about the Green Deal in the European Union, very interesting, because, this is, again, this is a question that is beyond economics. It's more in the area of politics. First of all, the EU is really trying to make a big deal with the Green Deal. Okay, and we have seen Green Deals in many other parts of the world. The Americans were talking about a Green Deal, but the Europeans, they have actually done it. And this is, of course, this is still needs to go through the European bureaucracy and the European very complex politics, but it is a major political decision on how this is going to apply. And I just so this is about 1 trillion euros. Now, how this is going to be done? Already there are some strategies. There are some investment plans. Actually, one is called the just transition. Okay, so this is how countries are going to to make a transition from producing energy through carbon, burning carbon, into more renewable type of types, and there is huge subsidies. Actually, Greece just announced a very big program that they're going to eliminate completely producing energy from lignite. Okay, and this is going to be all transformed into other forms of mostly renewable forms of energy. That is solar panels and wind energy, how does call this, earth heat, and so on and so forth. Huge projects. Now, there is a very interesting question which touches the politics and the diplomacy. I mean, why is, if this is, and this is something that the people that are dealing with European politics, they're always asking this question. This is a global problem. Why are we spending money in Europe? Is this going to solve anything? And the answer to this is that, first of all, Europe is a big economy, is going to contribute somehow, but the money they spend and the contribution they're going to get is not balancing each other. They're spending more money than how they're going to contribute to carbon. But there is a very interesting twist in this. There's a very interesting hypothesis, is that Europe, the European Union, is a major player in politics, and it can influence global politics. We have seen it in the past. We have seen it with trade agreements and so on. So if Europe has, as a major trade partner, has a policy that says, we are green, we want to reduce emissions, this is going to be reflected in trade agreements. So the partners of Europe, they will have to adjust to these policies. So if you want to sell products to Europe, you will have to show that also you're doing this. In this way, the hypothesis is, and this is really a big hypothesis for political scientists and analysts in diplomacy, how much Europe, this very aggressive, if you want, policy of Europe is going to affect global politics in terms of climate change and global emissions. This is a big question mark, but this is really what is driving this. This is what is behind in this debate.
Thank you, Professor Costas. Então, temos mais 10 minutos, mas eu vou...
We have another 10 minutes. I will summarize the questions, and then we will
responder o máximo possível de questões.
try to answer them. I would like to apologize to some people who sent questions. Please send us an email and we can answer the questions by email. Okay, Mr. Carlos Eduardo Cherry.
Vou tentar resumir pouco para a gente comentar os principais pontos, né? Mas as questões estão em torno justamente da...
The questions are about measuring carbon, carbon measurement. Every square meter has different levels. This variability, how does this influence sampling? How do you deal with the different amounts of carbon in the soil? Is it better to place carbon in the soil or plant trees? Which is best? Since there isn't a consensus in methodology for especially in tropical areas, how do you see the progress of the recognition of these assets? Removal, equilibrium, what are the prerequisites for selling credits? How can we measure also emissions in the soil and have this accepted by the markets? Easy questions. I will try to be as brief as possible, and then later on, we can also talk more about this with those who ask questions. From what I understood, yes, there is variability. This is inherent, both gas emissions and also carbon in the soil. There is variability. In my doctorate, I wrote a paper of geostatistics, the distribution of carbon in soil, to understand this variability. This is academic. You cannot apply this in evaluation and production systems. This is for us to understand. Carbon has a spatial variability that is greater than soil density. It varies, but less, and both are important for the stock of carbon. So the way we try to contemplate is repeating samples in the field. There's no other way. So we try to take 9 samples every 100 meters in order to reach 1 hectare. Is it enough? Not necessarily. But then we can calculate this variability. Another question, if it's worth the while, which is better? Which is planting trees or carbon in the soil? Both are important. Carbon came from vegetable material and then through vegetation and compounds, and it secretes organic acids, which is carbon. The aerial part, leaves drop, wastes drop, and so the idea is, if you plant trees or any culture, part of this plant will be fixed in the soil. So the idea of this question is, where will carbon stay longer? And I tell you, carbon in soil, when it interacts and is stabilized, can remain for centuries, and the tree for decades only. If it's for commercial use, it can be removed and transformed into another type of product. If it's, for example, if it's for furniture, a long time. Well, I believe this is the idea. We shouldn't choose one or another. Which is more important, the tree or fixing carbon in the soil? None of them is a priority. First, let's try to reduce emissions from practices, from sectors. Once this effort is made to reduce emission, then we try to fix in the soil. Otherwise, we would need 4 planets to plant all the trees if we continue with business as usual. So we need to reduce emissions and then fix it in the soil. Chris, the other question, standardization to calculate carbon. In academic means you have a standardization. We have ISO. Remember ISO? We have ISO standards, criteria, how you select, collect, how you prepare. So in academy, there are techniques. It's very well defined. The standardization, alternative techniques with spectroscopy, like infrared with laser. These are methods that are alternative in the near future. They may be used as standard methods. Now, for the market, what is the idea? People want to simplify. I know why, cost, time, but this simplification sometimes brings great uncertainty in something that is variable, that varies. And we, in agriculture, we impose even more variability by the way we plant. So we know how to do the evaluations. The difficulty is in how to simplify to go from academy to commercial measurement. And there, when you simplify, if you simplify too much, you increase variability, and this can generate and uncertainty. That's the difficulty we have. Are these the questions? Do we have more? Well, these are the questions. Okay, I tried to be brief. There are many other points we can mention. I would like to continue this discussion. Yes, we have many questions. Our time is almost up. I would like to ask one question, whoever can ask. We have many questions about coffee, and I would like to ask all of you, all the professors, and then we can close the debate. There are many questions. How can coffee producers have activities? How can farmers access the monetary benefits? How can farmers, coffee farmers, fix carbon in the soil and contribute for lowering emissions? Involving coffee, how can coffee farmers do this and be paid? Can I begin? I believe that it's very easy for coffee farmers. There must be someone to organize an association of producers or a company that depends on this raw material. And the organization will lead to lower costs in labs, will lower the costs of measurement in labs. For example, the greater the scale, the lower the cost. So if we can engage producers, farmers, and understand that productivity in the farm is linked to the accumulation of carbon in the soil. So the more productive the farmer is, more carbon we will have in the soil. I don't see any difficulty. There are some companies in Brazil that supply inputs for agriculture that they must have their objectives, of course, but certainly they really, what they do by using these methods, farmers become loyal to their products. Yes, there's a great opportunity via organization through cooperatives or a company can do this.
Agradeço muito a vocês. Alguém gostaria
Thank you. Anyone else? A last comment?
I see Samuel is speaking.
Samuel, open your phone.
Sorry. Eu gostaria de responder uma pergunta aqui.
I would like to answer a question from Jorge Souza. A very interesting question. How to continue producing and lowering emissions. We have ABC, low carbon agriculture, developed by Embrapa in Brazil, which is available for 5 years. There are credit lines even for this. To analyze deforestation, transforming them into intensive agriculture. This is a measure that will reduce, we can reconvert areas with less carbon emissions than deforestation. So convert areas instead of deforestation. And we can find this market that everyone is searching for. The incentives for farmers to have resources to be paid for low emissions and the generation of carbon credits.
Okay, sorry, just very briefly. I think it is turning into a very interesting part of this conversation now, and I wish we had more time, because I think at the end of the day is a combination of technology, and we see that the technology is there. The technology not only to use techniques to put the soil to put carbon into the soil, but also to measure, to monitor this and be able to certify. Because if it is not monitored, if it is not measured, it's not a commodity. It's not something that you can claim that you have done it. This is very important. And so technology is one. The second is governance, organization. how this is organized. I think Marco mentioned already cooperatives, but yes, for smaller producers and even for large producers, this we're talking about a very big issue. Then it is a matter of organizing into larger collectives. But I must say that I don't like to close with a pessimistic, but I am pessimistic there, because if we had seen, if there was capacity for these collectives, for these organizations, we would have seen them before. Farmers are producing a commodity, and we don't see these organizations how to sell their product. Will we see them now, that how they're going to sell just carbon? I wish we will. I wish that this will be a further incentive, because, as I said, it is a win-win situation. This is going to benefit everybody. It's going to benefit the farmers, and it's going to benefit the firms that are buying these products to the farmers and selling to the consumer. And the third actor there is governments. Okay, it's political will, because it's political will that can only manage and put really the incentives, the big incentives for a public good. Carbon and climate change and environment are public goods, and we know very well from our first year economics that public goods cannot be bought and sold in markets. So we need regulation. We need all these elements there. Sorry for taking time. Thank you very much. That was a very, 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 very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, organizers. Thank you.
Eu gostaria de, tomando a palavra, agradecer a todos os participantes. Para nós foi, sem dúvida, um encerramento muito motivador do ciclo do estudo feito em 2020.
The studies, especially to see the studies from 2020. It's very clear to me we have a problem. Both global governance can make progress quickly, like we saw in the last few months, post-Biden, or things can also get worse, like we saw in the government before Biden. So we need global governance where transnational institutions have to be improved. On the other end, we have a problem of micro strategy, companies, organizations, as mentioned, a company like UdC Caffè, who is with us, who has been with us. They made the decision, they have already defined their actions for carbon balance. And of course, this will affect the whole chain where they are present. So whether it be through global governance, whether it be in the micro strategy where things happen, companies, or on the other end, the consumer end, where maybe these efforts will represent higher costs. For example, Bill Gates last week in the meeting organized by President Biden, Bill Gates said, all the technologies that are environmentally friendly, have a cost. If they didn't have a cost, they would already have been adopted. So the vision of Bill Gates is very important. We must have things that will motivate actors to internalize this tremendous cost. We're talking about concepts that economists know. Market failure, we're talking about the mother of all the market failures results in global warming. And the challenge is the challenge of this generation. We cannot delay this. So the initiatives, whether they be macro with global governance or micro, acting with industry, cooperatives, producers, farmer, in the case of agriculture, to find solutions. So right now, this This made us think, it brought issues, so we reached our objective. I'd like to thank very much each one of the participants during last year in this debate, and right now, where we discuss this in the University of Coffee, UdC Coffee. I'd like to thank the participants. I'd like to mention to you that this year, we are making progress with a new topic in research, which is the balance of gender in the world of coffee. This is another challenge we have today. I'd like to thank very much, and with this, we would like to close with a great hug to Marco Fujihara, Samuel Ribeiro Giordano, Marco Antônio Fujihara, Constantinos Carantininis, Carlos Eduardo Cherry, Décio Gilberstein, to our friends in Trieste, our friends from UdC Caffè, a great hug. To the producers and academics with us, a great hug. Thank you very much. Take care. Take care in these difficult times, but we will overcome this. Soon we will be together. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. All of this is available for download, and soon we will have the recordings on the Pensa site. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Constantinos.